Hello YouTube, welcome back to the channel. So we're back with one of these recorded videos because first week of the NFL season, we're on Sunday. Right now, I'm missing part of the Packer game to record this because it's just that important that I have to do it. So first of all, praise the content gods as always. So now I get to have a little bit of fun with this one because this is revisiting a conversation that we had on the channel back in the day. It's been a long time, but it's one of those things where when the opportunity presents itself, you got to take advantage of it. So that's exactly what I'm going to do on this one. Now, unfortunately, this isn't going to be one of my epic reviews where I get to do a full-fledged recap of something because there just isn't as much material to bring up in this case. However, since this one was dropped in my lap, those of you who are reading the title, yes, the sports card therapist has resurfaced. For those of you who are not familiar or unaware, I'm going to give you a quick recap. I'll show you a couple of things. We'll play the clip from the podcast because the Sports Card Lessons podcast YouTube channel actually dropped the episode only some hours ago from the time I'm recording this with Rob Gerard, formerly known as the sports card therapist, which is beautiful timing. Praise the content gods as always. So this was a freebie for me. Also an opportunity to go and revisit a couple of old episodes. So there, his podcast episode in this case, which precipitated this video, and then a previous episode of the BIC podcast where we talked about this exact thing. It's still, I think, the most popular episode of the podcast we ever did because the timing was right and people were interested in it. It does bring up a couple of questions though that I do want to talk about. So I will touch on that a little bit, but I don't know what the runtime is going to be on this, but you're going to see that compared to some of the epic reactions that I've done, the runtime on this isn't going to be nearly as crazy because of the nature of the way this podcast went. But it does lead me to a question that I'll bring up at the very end for you. So to get things started, why don't I just go to the YouTube channel? We're going to go to the podcast episode itself. It's right from the beginning of the episode. We'll go right from there and we'll check this out and I'll show you, I'll do a couple of quick pauses along the way, but I'll show you exactly what it is that I have in mind as far as kind of what happened with this one. So here's the episode in question. We're going to play this a little bit. There we go, a little editing magic. So I'm gonna hit record. I have sped it up slightly for you so that we can get through the first portion of it a little bit quickly. But again, I'll pause a couple of times along the way. I'll reference a few things that I'll kind of share with you so you'll get the gist of it. And one thing I'm also gonna do is that once we play this a little bit, I'll actually play you another video that'll give a little bit more context to this as well. Now, real quick high level. The reason the sports card therapist thing became a thing back then, for those who aren't too familiar, he actually was for a little while a popular podcast host who during the pandemic period built up a podcast and was able to build up a pretty good platform and following with sponsors and everything else and kind of had a mini podcast network with a few other channels, including Ken here of Sports Card Lessons, who became part of that group. They called themselves the Wolf Pack. Well, the thing is, there was this group of these different podcasts that collaborated all the time, but as part of what he was doing and being around the hobby at the time, he was also able to collaborate and also do a lot of interviews and conversations with a lot of hobby luminaries. But then he was kind of embroiled in a little mini controversy, which by today's standards is very light. But the controversy was that he did what he called a mega bid on a couple of Eli Manning cards back then and didn't pay. Now, Rob obviously kept playing this off as he was just a non-paying bidder. He didn't really want to go down the shilling route. But at the same time, as the clip that I'll play for you after will show, it was really horrible timing by him because he had statements that we literally had from the podcast episodes that he had done only weeks and like a month or two before, where he took a very different stance on the way he thought about things at the time. And then he does this, and his response to it is kind of what gave more legs to it. Like I said, he kind of disappeared for the better part of 2 years, hence the title of this podcast episode. So let me hit play for starters, and I'll share with you kind of why I said there isn't as much meat on the bone for the podcast episode, but it does lead into a couple of fun things and some food for thought that we can take from this.
Welcome to the Sports Card Lessons Podcast. I'm your host, Big Ken. Whether you're watching on YouTube or listening on a streaming service, please like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you'll be notified whenever I drop any new content. Welcome. Thanks for being here. I'm going to call this a special episode. I get to bring an old friend on the show. If you've been watching on YouTube and you've been here since the beginning, tonight's guest is very familiar. And if you're new here, let me introduce tonight's guest, friend of mine, friend of the show. He is Rob G. Rob, how are you doing, my friend?
Big Ken, what is going on? Yeah, Rob G, formerly of Sports Card Therapist podcast, man. And I'm definitely happy to be here. And thanks for the invite.
It is great to have you back, like putting the old team back together.
Now I'm going to pause here for just 1 second before I let it continue. I know I'm going to let it run a little bit more, but real quick, the preamble is important because as I mentioned a moment ago, Ken was part of like this podcast group, this collective, this collaborative thing that they were going into that kind of Rob kind of helped spearhead. So there is a pre-existing relationship, which is pretty obvious. Like you can pretty much make it out right away. And also they'll go into their history in the course of this podcast episode if you want to go into it. Part of the reason I say that, I'm not surprised because of their friendship and their relationship that he will not kind of push back or challenge anything. They don't elaborate that much onto it. That's why I say it's a little disappointing in terms of the opportunity it would have been to elaborate a little bit further. But I also didn't expect it. So it's not a fair expectation. So I'm not going to put this on Ken here as far as the podcast was. The reason why he was able to get Rob on here in the first place was because they are friends, because they've continued to stay in touch after everything that went down. But I'll go into it here. I'm going to hit play again. But the relationship, the pre-existing relationship, is number one, why this podcast even exists now in the year 2025 of our Lord. And secondly, it's also why, you know, there's going to be automatically why it's going to be more of a friendly conversational approach, which is great for, you know, their banter back and forth. But in reality, it leaves the entire hook of this is Rob G, formerly the sports car therapist, on the podcast, which is going to draw additional eyeballs. But then you never actually get the meat of what people's curiosity was. They'll touch on it briefly, but that's about where it goes. So let me hit play and we'll continue.
You've been gone, right? Out of the spotlight, not out of the hobby, but out of the spotlight. Where have you been? What have you been doing? What have you been up to?
Yeah, so definitely been up to a lot. I'm definitely looking forward to, you know, really talking cards with you and jumping into everything you've been doing because, you know, I follow your podcast and, you know, so can't wait to, you know, talk about all your hobby currency, my hobby currency, all that good stuff. But yeah, I'll just, you know, quickly jump in and say, you know, I just want to give a shout out and an apology to any of my old listeners if they happen to catch this, because I abruptly stopped my podcast just about 2 years ago. We're coming up on like the 2-year mark right now. So when I just abruptly stopped my podcast, my plan was to take a week off and jump right back in, right? And you know, I ended up going all in on a few rare Eli Mannings that were up for auction back in 2023, and ended up being a non-payer on them. And so I apologize to the listeners and the people in the hobby for that. And my plan was to jump right back into my podcast after taking a week off. But what happened was, like, I took time off, and 1 week turned into 2 weeks. And in that time of it being 2 weeks, I just felt this enormous weight lifting off my shoulder. And you know, the Sports Card Therapist podcast and the brand, it became like a runaway train for me. And that's like the simplest way I can describe it. It was taking over my life. You know, it was 2 or 3 episodes a week. Plus I would guest on people's shows, sponsorships. And don't get me wrong, that was everything I had worked toward. That was everything I had wanted at that time. But when I took a step back, I realized how much of my life the hobby and the podcast had taken over. So I just never returned with my podcast. I never returned to Instagram. You know, it's that simple. And I took about 6 months off completely from the hobby. I just like took a step back. Like, I didn't buy a single card for about 6 months, and then began slowly collecting again. And I'll always be a sports card collector. For me, it's goats over prospecting, like I always used to say. And even though one of my mantras used to be participation is required, my participation is there, but it's a lot less now, and it looks different. You know, I still hit local shows. I still go to card stores when I'm traveling, and I try to do everything else hobby related. I'm still having a great time with the cardboard, and I do miss the interactions that were created from me having the podcast and me having that platform, especially with the relationships I had built in the hobby, you know. And I think that's why after I realized I didn't want to come back to the spotlight, I just didn't come back, you know. And for me, I didn't want to come back and clean up my brand that I no longer wanted anyways. Like, at that point, I was like, I'm done. I'm so far moved on from that. And at this point, you know, I'm being loyal to my future and not my past. You know, it's like we all grow at different rates, and that's okay. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Now, real quick, I'm pausing here because I wanted to let it run a little bit to let him give, you know, his explanation. So I'm not going to be overly mean about this, as tempting as it is. However, with that said, I am going to do this because it is Sunday. I am going to be watching some football as soon as I'm done with this. So we're cracking open the IPA. We're making this happen. Okay, look, here's the thing. In and of itself, what he said really wasn't an issue. And again, if you do check out the podcast, the BIC podcast episode where Eric, Brandon, and myself talk about this exact scenario in real time at the time that it was happening, we had a little bit of speculation about, you know, would he come back? What would that look like? What were the scenarios? But he touched on it. He literally hit very high level. This is where I say, like, I'm not going to blame Ken because he's a buddy of his. So obviously they want to have more of a conversational thing. They want to touch this right off the top. But at the same time, the reason why I say you're going to find that I'm not going to spend as much time reacting to this podcast episode in its entirety is because at a certain point, and you'll see how quickly it happens, they're going to quickly pivot to talking about just collecting in general, just talking about, you know, cards that Rob has picked up, you know, once he got back into the hobby, basically what he was doing since then and all that stuff offline, kind of, well, you know, online, but offline, if you know what I mean, compared to the public profile he had previously. Something that was not really mentioned here in his synopsis, in his brief rundown, was that there was an Instagram apology that was included, which I may play a clip of for you in a minute, allegedly. And I may leave a link in the description to how you can watch in its entirety, should you be so inclined. Again, allegedly. But the point is that that was part of what led to the mini firestorm at the time of the way this was done. But also, really quick, and I think this is important, is that it's not just that he looked at it, reevaluated, and said, okay, you know what, this is taking up a lot of my time. You know, it's become this drain on my life and time and all these things, kind of what he's alluding to here. And then when he walked away from it, he realized this weight is lifted off his shoulders, this burden was off of him, and he decided to just stay away, which is, again, perfectly valid. That is completely fine, because it can be a bit of a grind to go forward, especially if you're producing the amount of content he was at the time. And with all the collaborations and all the requirements of different sponsors and all the things that he was doing. But also, I would be remiss if I didn't point out, for the sake of hashtag scholarship, that just prior to that, again, in the weeks and months leading up to the whole incident that created this thing and caused him to disappear, was that he was bragging about his metrics and his numbers and how well he was doing at the time. This is important. He did, in fact, do that. Another piece that I should also be remiss if I fail to mention was that once he decided that he wasn't really going to come back anymore, it doesn't mean you have to delete your Instagram profile and whatnot. That's what actually led to more fuel to the whole speculation piece at the time. You could have said, you know what, I'm going to take some time away to reevaluate. And then once you realize, you know what, I'm going to step away from this brand. I'm no longer going to be associated with this. I'm going to be a collector offline, which is basically what he talks about here. Then you still have the option to say, hey, everybody, just to let you know, I'm not going to be restarting the podcast and everything. The stuff is archived there. Have at it. But here's the thing. It's not archived there. The podcast itself was scrubbed. A lot of that stuff was taken away, which is different from what he was talking about. I just want to focus on the future, not the past. It's like, well, there's focusing on the future, not the past. And then there's trying to like scrub the past and completely ignore and, you know, getting it offline to the best of your ability, because obviously the internet remembers everything. Everything is forever. That's actually a step further. That is you actively trying to scrub some of the past from there and kind of disconnecting a lot of these things. Like, you can turn off your Instagram or delete your access to a profile, and then people can DM you till the cows come home and they can't reach you, if that's your desire, if that's what you want to do. That's different than kind of disconnecting and deleting a bunch of things and also taking care of because again, there was a lot of content on there, regardless of what people thought about Rob at the time, especially since he was a bit of a controversial figure for that brief moment in time. Stuff like that blows over. We know in this hobby, people forget. But he chose instead to try to basically delete all the files, so to speak, which always kind of makes people go like, well, why would you... like random interviews with collectors and stuff, like standard collaborations, like why scrub everything? And that would have been a good follow-up question that Ken could have asked. But again, I'm going back to what I said a moment ago. They have that existing relationship. Obviously, they're still in contact afterwards. So I can't expect him to follow up with that. But that would be like my first follow-up question. I go, okay, you decided you're going to step away. That's cool. You said you still wanted to participate in the hobby, but in a different way, in a more scaled down, low-key way. Fair enough. But why scrub everything? Why take the full scorched earth approach and just literally try to clean everything out? That's a little bit different than kind of the upbeat positive spin that was put on this, which could be, again, still true, but then the actions also kind of suggest something else. Why did you go that route instead of just being like, just don't post anything else? Just leave it dormant that way. I know more than a few folks that have kind of stepped away from it, decided they didn't want to make videos or podcasts or anything anymore, and they just leave it there to be archived. If people want to see it down the road and watch an old episode of something, it's there. But they just disconnect from it and they leave it there, or they abandon old Instagram handles and things like that. That happens all the time. That's not an unusual thing, but it was kind of the approach that he took to it, coming off immediate heat in that moment. It wasn't like he took a couple of weeks or a couple of months and then started deleting everything. Stuff kind of disappeared almost overnight. It was the speed at which it was done after he started getting some heat that kind of leads the follow-up questions that we're not going to get here. So now let me hit play a little bit. I'll let it run and you'll see kind of why I gave more elaboration than the clip is going to show.
I'm at right now.
I do have to say, one of the biggest questions I've gotten over 2 years is, how's Rob doing? So well, I'm glad you're here, right? I'm glad that, the people who can tune in can see how Rob's doing,
Listen, much love to all of those people, whether if they were a supporter or on the opposite end of the spectrum. Much love to them. I've had, listeners over the last 2 years just like find creative ways to reach out to me, and all different ways, and just always humbling, and I was humbled with, everything that took place for sure. And I think I needed to be humbled. I think I needed to get knocked off a little bit, because of, where I was at right now. And I think it took something like me having to take that full big giant step away from the hobby and just like abruptly go. It took something like that for me to get back my life. If that makes sense.
Yeah. And sometimes you don't know it, right? So you had no idea. And you stepped away, right? And you look back and you realize, wow, I needed this, and I guess, how lucky are you? Right. In all this crazy sense, right? How lucky are you for that to happen to you so that it didn't turn into anything more than, what it did?
Yeah. And I could remember too, you would say little things to me like, yeah, man, I'm going here and I'm going there. And it's easy for me because my kids are grown. You have 2 young kids, and never did you say it in a way like, you're like, wow, Rob, I can't believe you're leaving your family for the weekend and stuff like that. But like those little things, like I would hear them, but they wouldn't like fully sink in because I was still very active in my family life and stuff. But I think it took stepping away to realize how much more active I could have been. Because think about it, we were going to shows every weekend. You and I, we were traveling together. We were, driving together, setting up together, doing podcasts together, doing lives together. We were, and it was amazing. It was amazing.
You're still describing my life right now.
Exactly. I know. And the great thing is, like, you're retired or semi-retired. You know what I mean? And so you can do those things, and that's amazing. And a tiny part of me envies it, but I've also been there, done that, bought the T-shirt. So I think I'm good. Like, like I see you, I see other podcasts, I see doing great, and I'm like, that's awesome. That's awesome. I'm just, I root for everyone in that regard.
Yeah. And it's interesting to be like when you get to the other side, right? And that's like one of the questions I have for you. Like, do you still follow all the content? And do you I'm sure.
Okay, I'm going to pause there because then this kind of transitions over into a conversation of, does he watch the content? The answer is not really much, other than the odd episode of Sports Card Lessons, his buddy's podcast. And then you'll notice the timestamp, 7 minutes and 34 seconds. Oh, but Carlos, there's 56 more minutes. There are 56 more minutes. And to be clear, I'm going to leave a link in the description if you want to watch the rest of it. But the remainder of it very quickly from here, there's a couple of more minutes where they, kind of reminisce a little bit. But then it shifts over into talking about, his latest collecting ventures. He collects these cards. He picked up a card of this. He had replaced this card. And talking about, basically, if you go from about here, or the next couple of minutes, to the remainder in the close of the podcast, if you didn't know anything about Rob Gerard or any background or any history, it would be pretty much a standard collector conversation talking about, hey, what's in your collection? Hey, what do you pick up? Hey, what kind of stuff are you looking for? What were you doing before versus what's doing now? The interesting part, the hook that this entire thing is to draw, the sports card therapist back for the first time in 2 years, basically. The hook here for this particular podcast episode, the most interesting portion of it, or the potential questions that could have been asked, is already finished at 7 minutes and 34 seconds. Which, again, I gave my pretext, like, I'm not going to blame the guy because he's not going to hammer his buddy. You're not going to get the heat lamp treatment on this one, I'm afraid. And Rob was ready to give an answer. He had a pretty much succinct response to, hey, what happened there and what's been up to you? And he gave like the short version. And that was it. That was all that you were going to get from that one. So that was kind of, like I said, that's why it's not going to be my standard operating. Like, I think I'm going to do a little bit of editing to cut out some little steps in between while I was getting all the videos and everything queued up. But for the most part, I think it's going to be a shorter runtime. However, I do want to play something for you that I think would be kind of fun to give a little bit a reminder. Because like I said, I tried to give a quick synopsis of this, but I do think it would be kind of fun to at least play a little bit of this. Because again, I mentioned a moment ago that it was a little bit of a different tune at the time, because when it initially happened, the first thing was to do a little damage control. It was to talk about it and give, your side of the story, which is perfectly fine. But like the approach that was given is basically what makes it a little bit more interesting here.
Hey guys, how you doing? Rob, sports card therapist here. Just wanted to jump on and do a live. I tried reaching out to a couple individuals that had been tagging me. I was hoping that, maybe I could get some kind of questions and all that good stuff. But what I want to say is I was a non-buyer. I was a non-payer on 2 Eli Manning Prism Golds out of 10 that had popped up 2 weeks ago. I think it was November 3rd was the date. What I will say is that I do not own the 2 cards that I was a non-payer on. I've actually never owned an Eli Prism Gold out of 10. Never owned one before, and I desperately wanted to own these cards. All week I was talking about how I was going to mega bid on all of these because my goal was to acquire all them. I don't own a single one, and I never have. So, I want to apologize. I'm a non-paying bidder, and that was my mistake. I apologize for that. I should have realized that I probably wasn't going to be the only mega bidder. And when I saw the final price come in, I think it was like $18.52 on the PSA 10. I was certain that card was show bid because it was by far the highest.
Now, I could play more of that, like I said. Again, there may be a link in the description to an archive so that you can see it in its entirety if you wish. The point is that at the time, there were already a lot of excuses built into it. So that's why I say the sequence of events that is given in the quick synopsis on the podcast episode is perfectly fine. But again, it kind of leaves out a couple of details. It was that this happened, it was called out, and I think at the time, memory serves me, and some people may remember this a little better than I because it has been a couple of years. I believe at the time it was a cell phone, because in reality, the auction happened and there was something going on with that. And Rob mentioned something And that kind of led to people realizing what was going on with that. And as a result, it was kind of like he outed himself at the time, I believe. Again, I'm just going off memory here. But because of that, that's what kind of led to the mini firestorm. It led to the, Instagram post where he was talking about it. And all those components kind of came together. And that was kind of what made it interesting at the time. But again, the hobby has a short memory. If something happens, you become a meme for a little while, people poke fun at you for doing stuff like that. But I think an important key, and this is what's going to play now in the podcast episode I was talking about, I'll play a clip of that for you. And when I do, the very first thing I mentioned is that if you're just a rando in the hobby and that happens, well, a couple people might dunk on you, but nobody really knows who you are, so they're really not going to care one way or the other. But as soon as you build a platform, especially when you build a platform and you also bragged about how big your platform was at that time, right before that, then people are looking at you going like, if something happens, it's like, okay, now all of a sudden you've drawn more attention to yourself, and now it's like the pride is greatest before the fall and that kind of thing. And I think all that played into making it more of a story than it was at the time. But even then, if he had decided just to stick it out, it would have blown over in a couple of weeks probably at the most. Realistically, that's what happens, because there are more egregious things that people have done, and even then some of that stuff blows over. So it's like, this is the angle. If he wanted that to use as his way to get out and everything, that's perfectly fine. But that doesn't exactly play into the action of first having an Instagram kind of apology explanation and then suddenly scrubbing all your social medias and basically disappearing at the time. And apparently the light of the content gods has really decided to shine upon me. I have a window directly in front of this, which makes it even brighter. So I'm trying to decide if I even need the little light above. At this point, it's redundant. I have ascending, basically. Anyway, so bottom line, I'm going to play a little bit of the podcast episode for you a little bit now. I'm going to take it right from about 5 minutes and 30 seconds. I'm going to leave a link in the description for you if you want to check this episode out. Again, it's our most viewed episode that we've ever done on this particular thing because this topic resonated with people at the time. But I do want to play a little bit of it and kind of give you a little background because I do give an explanation. And I also play another clip for you that was appropriate at the time, given kind of where things were sitting, because I had grabbed and archived a couple of old Sports Card Therapist episodes that I felt were appropriate, given basically what had happened. All right, so here's the episode, appropriately named The Last Sports Card Therapy Session for Now. Loved it. So let me play a little bit of this for you, and I'll take it right from here.
Part of the reason I think this one stood out, and I think our friend Andy, Sports Card Investigator, actually did a video earlier tonight that took off, and he made the correct point. If somebody was a jag, just a guy, this doesn't get any traction. Because if it's just a regular individual and it's a show bidding situation or an alleged show bidding situation, whatever you want, yeah, maybe it's notable to a small group of people. Word gets around a little bit. You share a little bit. Hey, don't deal with this guy. Block this eBay bidder. They're not acting in an appropriate way. That's about the extent of it. That's the end. But if you have a profile in the hobby at all, deserved, undeserved, that's not my place to dictate. But if you have any kind of a profile and you've been on the record saying things or standing on a moral high ground, that's where people look at you, and that's where hubris kicks in. If any of you are familiar with hubris, that's a situation where in Greek tragedy, it's your self-confidence, excessive self-confidence, that then kind of dictates your downfall because you put yourself up on a pedestal, and that's where people are happy to see you get knocked down because you kind of created the scenario. Again, hubris. So I'm actually going to play a clip with the guys, and then I want to get their takes on it. So I'm going to play it for you, and I will include a link to this. It is an unlisted video on the channel, but I'll include a link to this one and make it available to folks if they want to listen to it in entirety themselves. This is actually an excerpt from the aforementioned formerly existing Sports Card Therapist podcast. And this is episode number 214, a specific clip about it. So I'm going to play it for you guys, and then we'll take a closer look at it here. The magic of editing, I even added a lovely little graphics so that we can remember it. Remember the better times when the logo existed. This was still on the internet. So I'm going to hit play for you. I have sped it up slightly, just 1.25, but you're going to listen to it. So specifically, this episode is episode 214, previously existing podcast. And the title was Bad Actors or Lapse in Judgment, ? With Adam Gray, the Real 27 guy. And this clip, and a couple of clips I put together here, is pertaining to the Shaywave Vlogs controversy. If any of you remember, when Shaywave Vlogs was shilling on his own cards. So this is related to shilling, but a different situation. But just listen to what is being said, which is ironic in context of what ended up happening here.
And you know what? I think that's a really good just life lesson, even outside of the hobby, right? Like if you get caught in something, own it. Show humility, try to be sincere and truly feel it. And don't worry about saving face, right? Don't worry about saving face, because I think sometimes people want to have it both ways. They want to apologize, be humble, but at the same time also kind of save face and throw in a justification for it. And it's like you really can't have it both ways in most cases, and in this case in general. And I love what you're saying, and because I've said it so many times on my podcast, and not even really talking about hobby stuff or the fraud stuff, but I've always talked about how I believe in second chances, third chances, fourth chances. And I'm not saying I'm going to continually give people like opportunities to screw me over or to screw others over, but what I'm saying is I think it's human nature that we do make mistakes. However, I think it's safe to say that it probably wasn't his first time, it probably wasn't the second time, it's probably been a pattern of behaviors, and I think that's stuff that needs to be acknowledged.
But Rob, let me ask you, I'm just going to pause for a second. Do you see the irony in that entire sequence of about 1 minute? And this was maybe a month and a half, 2 months ago on his podcast, talking about a different situation. But then I want you to think of the current situation. I'm going to play a little bit more. I've got another 3 minutes. This is a separate piece of the clip, so I've got it broken up into a couple pieces. But this is the first part where Rob, the sports card therapist, is talking all by himself, specifically about that. In context of where we ended up, how interesting that's the tact he ended up taking in comparison to what ended up happening. So that's the first piece. I'm going to now hit play again, and I'm going to play a little bit more. Now Adam's going to chime in here, and then Rob is going to keep talking.
It's because that's not popular. Again, I'm at risk in saying that people like thinking that I'm like part of it or something. I don't know why, because again, like I've been very clear, right? You think I've been clear? Like, how do you
100%.
feel? How do you think about what I said?
Well, I don't think that you condone any of this, and I certainly don't as well. And just because we believe in forgiveness and treating everyone, with respect and dignity, even though they might not have treated the hobby in certain aspects with those same attributes, I still think that we deserve that and it's really a selfish thing, right? It's like, I don't vilify him because I feel bad for him. Like, I don't vilify him because I don't want to be the person that starts vilifying people. Like, I don't like what that does to me. I don't want to drink that poison, that internal poison, But what I would say, and I think a little bit of pushback I would have on what you said is, so I interviewed Rick Probstein on my show probably like 18 months ago, and the subject of Mastro came up. Mastro was involved in just a lot of fraud in the hobby, trimming, all this stuff. I think he even went to prison for a little while. And Rick Probstein, who's I think still friends with Mastro to this day, was like, guys, listen, Mastro, we need to stop like vilifying guys like Mastro. Like, he didn't kill anyone. He did not kill anyone. And I can remember clear as day that my response to him was, well, you're right, he didn't kill anyone. However, when we're looking at this through a hobby lens, we need to look at what is equivalent to capital punishment. Like, in this hobby. So in this hobby, what are the biggest offenses that you can do to others, right? And really up there I think a lot of our minds are, aside from like robbery and stealing cards out of someone's showcase or burglarizing someone's house for their cards. If we're talking white collar type stuff, I think card trimming and shilling is right up there at the top. Yeah. So even though I don't want to cancel anyone, I don't believe in cancel culture. I believe that everyone deserves chances, right? I'm not saying I would ever do a deal with someone like Shay, because of this. I don't know if I would have him on my show and kind of present in arms with him because of that.
I'll bet you'd think twice, 3-4 times before doing a deal with him. But would you do a deal with him?
I would have to know the particulars. I don't think I would, though. I really don't. I think because even though I don't want to cancel people out and I don't want to vilify people, I also don't want to stand next to them if they're doing things that I definitely don't believe in.
How interesting. In context. So I didn't play the whole thing. The entire podcast episode is a different kettle of fish, but I think those particular pair of snippets, there are two separate snippets that I put together in that compilation there, but they were from the exact same episode, talking about the exact same thing. Now, in living context of what actually ended up happening less than 2 months later, Eric, that's poetry. That's beautiful symmetry. There's where we ended up here.
Okay, so I can let that run for a little while longer, but I think you get the gist of it. And like I said, I'll leave a link in the description to it so that I kind of played all the way through, and we have a full discussion on it and everything. But I think the key is, and what's funny, the irony of this is that that particular podcast episode snippet that was played on there was talking about Shay Ray Vlogs and the situation that happened with Shay, or I guess his name was Shay, and shillbiting. And the thing is, maybe about a year ago, Shay reemerged and reappeared. He did like an episode on a YouTube channel with Cage Lawyer, and did a couple of videos related. He was talking about CT scanners and stuff. He kind of reappeared. He reemerged, and he had been away for a while. So it's one of those things. Like, we've got a long-standing history of people reappearing, and also referenced in that little clip was there the Probstein thing. Well, Probstein did an interview with Bill Mastro a couple of years ago back on his Instagram page. So again, it doesn't matter how much hobby villainy there is. There's somebody out there that will vouch for you or bring it up. Now, the reason that I wanted to kind of touch on this is twofold. Number one, obviously, it is timely that the sports card therapist reemerged. It sounds like, based on the conversation they have, you can check out the rest of the podcast episode included in there. For the most part, it's just talking about collections and collecting and, hey, what are you looking for these days and stuff like that. Standard stuff that you could get on any regular podcast episode. The interesting stuff was the first couple of minutes, and really then, like I said, they didn't go into the depth that I would love to have seen to get a little bit more like, okay, but why did you choose to scrub all your stuff? Why was your approach literally to do a scorched earth? Why did you want to just eliminate everything? Because again, the podcast itself, the actual podcast, so I played you a clip there in that section. Well, that podcast is gone too. So any interviews, all conversations, any backstory or history with that, even conversations where somebody talked about something, that's kind of scrubbed off the internet unless you happen to have an archive somewhere. The point is that it's like, when you take that approach, you're basically saying you want to completely create an insulation and separate yourself from it. So then the follow-up question would be, okay, but why did you take that approach? Walking away is one thing. You could have just made like a little quick snippet, a post saying, hey, I'm going to step away from this. I may not come back to it, but thanks for the support, and maybe we'll see you down the road. And that's it. You don't really have to spend more time on it. And he chose not to do that and just kind of reappeared briefly. It sounds to me like he's not going to be making regular appearances here and there outside of being in his local area, which is his prerogative. He certainly can do that. But I think one thing that kind of is going to lead me into the discussion that I want to have on this week's podcast coming up on Tuesday is that Ken's interview conversation with him kind of follows the normal pattern that I see in the hobby, where oftentimes, even if somebody does something wrong, or even if somebody does something that we would, say, oh, but that was kind of inappropriate, but, well, they're my buddy. Or, hey, I have a great relationship with them, so I'm going to kind of look past some of that stuff. I may not condone what's been said or what's been done or whatever, but at the same time, I'm going to take kind of a very light approach to it, which again is fine. You can do whatever you want. But that's standard operating procedure in the hobby, because in reality, that plays into every aspect of relationships in this whole industry. And even collectors who may want to act like they're immune to it, they're not immune to it. I did the conversation with Simon 466 Cards, the Praise the Content Gods episode, the beautifully named mini series that I'm doing. And we were talking about an example of Chris Hoge and Ken Golden. and they had a little blow up on an Instagram live when they were doing the crossover episode. We referenced it in that episode, and we thought it was funny. We had a little back and forth conversation about it, and it was two CEOs technically of two companies or two divisions of companies, basically bickering like children. And what's funny is that the comment section sided very heavily with Chris Hoge because a lot of them like him more, and it's Ken Golden, and a lot of people don't like Ken Golden because of all the stuff he does, and he's got a whole history of like questionable dealings. Let's just say, put it in quotation marks, questionable things that we can go back to in history over the course of decades. So Ken Golden's reputation precedes him in that regard. Well, the funny thing about that whole deal was that a lot of these people automatically sided with Hoge because they liked him better. His personality, whatever they perceive him to be, they liked him better. Well, the funny thing is Ken was right. And not only was he right, once he provided the evidence to the information that was going on, he was very angry about it. His approach to it was very bad, very unprofessional. But Chris's approach to it in response was very bad and very unprofessional. And that was kind of our point at the time. But what's funny is the person who people liked was actually 100% wrong. And once that evidence was provided, they reinstated a sale that they had originally claimed was questionable, and they provided the information, and then they restored it in the card ladder platform. So the person who people liked was actually 100% incorrect. And the person that people did like, the villain in the story, was correct. They were in the right. So the question is, it shouldn't be about who you like. It should be about who is actually correct, or who's actually giving the correct statement or trying to set the record straight. And in this case, Ken obviously has every incentive because it's his auction house. If somebody questions, impropriety and everything, and something that is considered a vetted source, because again, that's the whole card ladder marketing spiel, is that they vet everything. Well, their vetting failed, or the vetting was incomplete, or they didn't actually bother to do the full check before making a pronouncement on it or making it into question. Ken's response to it was incorrect, it was over the top, but that's basically been his style since forever. But again, it goes back to, we have to remember that just because somebody treats us well or that we like somebody, it doesn't mean they're perfect. The halo effect should only go so far when it comes to a lot of that stuff. And that's what was kind of funny, is that, again, the sports car therapist thing was that, so we cast a judgment, and your very own words basically were there being used against you only weeks or months after saying them, because you took this hardline approach, and then you became kind of a hypocrite when all of a sudden the light was turned on you because you had done something which a lot of the hobby would frown upon. You made a bid and then were, in your words, a non-paying bidder. Problem is, like I mentioned, and I've had side conversations with people where I talk about this, is like, if you're just Joe Blow in the hobby and whatever, then a lot of things you say or a lot of things you do, maybe we don't agree with the things you did, but nobody's really going to care that much. But the bigger the profile, the more you have elevated yourself in any way, whether you deserve it or don't deserve it, whether other people did it for you or whether you managed to do it yourself. As soon as you have a platform, though, then it becomes a lot more important to be a lot more careful with your approach. It becomes a lot more important to be a lot more careful with what you say, how you say it, and who you say it to, because at the end of the day now, you are going to be held, fairly or unfairly, to a higher standard. I have to hold you to a higher bar once you build up that platform, because now you become an authority to some people. And as soon as that happens, the moment that happens, your responsibility actually goes up. That's why I say, like, it's funny that a lot of people will look past that and take two equivalent people or people in the similar sphere, and we really side with the one we like. The one that we don't like, whether they're right or wrong, we just assume they're wrong. And the person that we like, we're just going to assume they're right, even if that turns out not to be the case. And that happens all the time. And that's why I say, like, I think it would have been funny if a sports car therapist had decided to stick around or had come back down the road at some point, even with a scaled back schedule. I think it would have been fine, because he had plenty of supporters, even for all the flack he would have gotten initially. And we said that in the podcast at the time. He would have gotten a bunch of flack initially, but eventually his supporters would have still been there. He might have had a smaller audience, maybe not as big as he was previously, but eventually some people would have forgotten about it, would have forgiven, or some new people would have come in and they would have gone, hey, here's a podcast, check this out. Because other people would recommend it and they'd check it out and, oh, this guy sounds pretty good. And they would just listen to episodes and you just go along. If you didn't want to be involved in it anymore, and this was like kind of your excuse to have a good break from it, that's perfectly valid. And that's kind of the angle that he's decided to take on it. But that's why I say, like, it's almost kind of funny that and I can't blame Ken for this, because he knows back of mind somewhere that this hook will draw some additional eyeballs to this episode compared to the standard episode. Like a regular collective conversation isn't going to draw the attention that this one will draw, or reaction videos like this one, that a regular conversation would have. But at the same time, you only gave us about maybe 5 minutes. And it's like, well, I had a couple of follow-up questions, or I'd have a couple of follow-up questions based on this. And unfortunately, we're not going to get them. So that's why I say, like, the actual reaction piece of this was minimal compared to normal. But anyway, so that's it for this one. I wanted to have a little bit of fun. Praise the content gods. salute. I'm going to watch the rest of the Packer game now. What I am going to do as well is I'll leave links in the description to the episode from Sports Card Lessons where this is on, and I'll leave an episode. It was at BIC 48. I'll leave an episode to that if you want to check it out. I played the clips and we talked through a little bit of that. That was from back then, so you're able to get our sense of what our thoughts were at the time. And then also there may be a link to an apology video that was referenced during the course of this. So maybe there is a video out there, so we'll include that in there as well. It gives context to the rest of it if you want to check it out, allegedly. So that's it. Bonus Sunday episode. Enjoy. Hopefully we had some fun with this one. Like I said, we're not going to worry about it too much going forward because it sounds like he's going to be kind of on the outside, kind of keeping it low key. But it was kind of fun to see a couple of years after the sports card therapist popped his head up for a brief moment. So a brief session of therapy after all these years. So we were back, but it looks sadly like our time is up once again. That's it. That's it for this one. More videos coming up on the channel. Live streams on Fridays at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The longest running episodic, whatever it is, we don't know. Now, if you did watch this past week on Friday, we were introduced to a new character that Eric personally created. And I think we may have a little follow-up. Speaking of follow-ups, I think we may have a little follow-up with that on Friday. Allegedly, at the top of the episode. I'm just throwing it out there. Just something you may want to keep in mind. That's it. That's it for this one. Like if you like the video, subscribe to the channel. Thanks very much. And we'll catch you in the next one.